The classroom had that quiet tension that comes just before an academic event, trials of wooden chairs, whiteboards filled with complex graphs, and the soft tap of chalk being prepped by someone who believed no one in the room would ever challenge him. Professor Langston, known for his brilliance and ego in equal measure, adjusted his blazer and looked around the seminar room, filled with bright young minds, reporters, and a few curious visitors. Today's session was not just about math, it was about performance, prestige, and proving intellect. Among the back row observers stood a woman who looked very out of place. She wore a faded blue kurta, simple sneakers, and carried no notebook, no phone, no laptop. Her hair was tied in a modest braid, and she clutched a cloth bag that looked more suited for groceries than academia. Some thought she was someone's aunt, others assumed she had wandered in by mistake. The professor noticed her as he moved toward the board. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. He leaned toward the microphone and with a condescending smile said, "Looks like we have a guest from the real world today. Welcome, madam. I hope the equations do not frighten you." Laughter rippled through the room, light but not kind. The woman gave a small smile and said nothing. She simply stood quietly at the back, her eyes fixed on the board, calm and unshaken. Langston loved these moments. His career was built on intellectual theater, and today he was about to perform his favorite trick, a calculus problem so difficult that even PhDs in the room would hesitate. He turned and wrote furiously across the board, integrals, limits, nested derivatives. The final expression stretched across 5 lines. He capped the marker and said, "Anyone who solves this in under 5 minutes will get my personal recommendation to the best math institutes in the country." There was silence, and then the woman in the kurta stepped forward. The room shifted uncomfortably as the woman walked slowly toward the board. Her steps were measured, deliberate, not shy, but not boastful either. Professor Langston arched an eyebrow and stepped aside, clearly amused. "You want to give it a try?" he asked, voice thick with irony. Calculus is not usually a hobby for casual visitors. The woman offered a soft smile. "I used to teach," she said simply. "Long ago." That answer brought more laughter, low and skeptical. A few students whispered to each other. Some were entertained. Others were embarrassed on her behalf. But the woman's focus remained on the board, her eyes scanning the intricate lines of the problem Langston had written. She picked up the marker with steady fingers. Her hand moved gracefully, first drawing a small substitution step in the corner of the board, then beginning a series of simplifications that were clean, swift, and elegant. Her handwriting was neat, confident. Every line she wrote reduced the chaos of Langston's monster equation into something more manageable, more familiar. Within 30 seconds, people started to lean forward. The scoffing students at the front now exchanged puzzled looks. One of them opened a notebook and began to mirror her steps, only to fall behind within moments. Langston folded his arms. Smirk on his face faded. The woman continued, unhurried. She reached the midpoint of the equation and introduced an integral identity so obscure, even the graduate students had to pull out their phones to verify it. She was not solving by brute force. She was dancing through the math with the clarity of someone who understood the soul of the equation, and then she reached the final derivative. With one last flick of her wrist, she wrote the answer and placed the marker down gently on the ledge beneath the board. No flourish, no bow. She simply turned to Professor Langston and said, "Your function has a removable discontinuity at x equals 0. You might want to double-check the assumptions." Silence was deafening. Langston stared at the board, then at her. His mind tried to catch up with what he had just witnessed, but the answer was there, perfect, clean, and entirely correct. The classroom remained suspended in silence for a moment longer, the only sound being the quiet squeak of a chair as one of the students shifted in stunned disbelief. Professor Langston blinked as if waking from a dream. He turned slowly toward the whiteboard, reading every step she had written, tracing it with his eyes. There were no mistakes, no shortcuts, no approximations. The entire solution flowed like a stream, interrupted and precise. He recognized the integral trick she had used, that was not even in the course syllabus. He had not taught it in years. It was the kind of advanced technique only those who lived and breathed the subject would remember. Double quotes. "Who or you?" Langston asked, the arrogance in his voice now replaced by something unfamiliar respect. The woman tilted her head slightly. "I used to be a lecturer at the university," she said softly. "Before I took time off to raise my children, mathematics has always been part of me." A ripple went through the classroom. Some of the students began clapping instinctively awkwardly at first, then louder, until the room filled with genuine applause. One of the students who had been laughing earlier now stared at the board in awe, muttering under his breath that was beautiful. Langston stepped forward and looked closely at the board. This is ... exceptional. I've never seen anyone solve it like this. I wrote that problem to be unsolvable within 15 minutes. She smiled gently. Then you should know better than to underestimate people based on appearances. Her words were not angry. There was no bitterness in her tone, just quiet truth. And somehow, that made it all hit harder. Langston felt his face flushed out with embarrassment, but with something deeper: shame, humility, the realization that he had judged someone not by their knowledge but by their clothes, their age. Silence. As the applause died down, Professor Langston stood motionless in front of the class, the chalk still in his hand, though he no longer needed it. He glanced at the woman again, her calm posture, her gentle smile, the quiet power in her presence, and then turned back to the board. He reread every line she had written, now not as a teacher trying to find fault, but as a student trying to learn. The woman stepped away from the board and walked back toward the rows of students. They parted instinctively, clearing a path for her, no longer seeing her as an outsider. She had crossed an invisible line, not just through her intellect, but through grace, humility, and undeniable brilliance. One young woman at the front raised her hand timidly. "Excuse me? Would you consider teaching us more?" "I mean, if you ever have time." The woman blinked, clearly surprised. "Oh, I'm not here to, but you should," another student interrupted. "That was the first time I actually understood what this problem meant. You didn't just solve it. You explained it with your steps. It made sense." Others began to nod in agreement. Even Langston found himself speaking without thinking. "If you were ever interested in guest lecturing, the door is open, wide open." There was no pride in his voice anymore, only awe. The students could feel it. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. The class had come to witness a routine lecture, perhaps even a public humiliation. Instead, they had witnessed a transformation, one that would stay with them far beyond the chalk and formulas on the board. The woman looked around, taking in the faces no longer filled with judgment or doubt, but with wonder. She thought of the years she had spent tutoring her children at home, solving complex problems at the kitchen table, while the world outside forgot she existed. She never stopped loving the subject, even when the world stopped acknowledging her for it. And now here she was. After class ended, word spread quickly through the campus. A few students posted about it online, calling it the most inspiring thing they had ever seen in a math class. Some shared blurry phone footage of her solving the equation, her hands moving with certainty, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her dreams for years. By that evening, the dean of the mathematics department had already reached out. A formal invitation was extended not just to teach, but to speak at an upcoming symposium on mathematical reasoning. When she received the email, she sat staring at it for a long time, her fingers hovering above the keyboard in disbelief. For years she had carried the burden of being invisible, brilliant, but hidden. Life had pulled her away from academic halls, from papers and chalkboards, and placed her in the world of caretaking, of quiet survival. She never resented it, but she never stopped dreaming either. And now the dream had come back, knocking louder than ever. The next day, she returned to the campus not in disguise, not to quietly sit in the back, but as a guest. She was met at the door by the same professor who had mocked her, but this time he did not smirk. He offered his hand. "Marissa," he said gently, "you changed more than a classroom yesterday. You changed me. I was arrogant and blind too. What really matters in this field? Talent, understanding, heart. I am sorry." She shook his hand without bitterness. "We are all still learning," she said, "even teachers." That afternoon, she stood once more in front of a packed lecture hall, not to prove herself, but to teach. Students scribbled notes as she broke down advanced calculus theories with ease, translating them into stories, patterns, human meaning. It was math, but it felt like poetry. This time she did not hear laughter, only silence, then pens, then claps, and later, heartfelt thank yous from students who had struggled for years to understand, only now finally finding clarity through her voice. Weeks passed, and Marissa's quiet return to mathematics sparked waves far beyond the classroom. The video of her solving the problem in seconds had gone viral, not because it was flashy, but because it was real. The world was drawn to her calm strength, her humility, and her brilliance that had been overlooked for so long. Offers began to come in from think tanks, research labs, even publishing houses, asking if she would consider writing about her approach to intuitive learning. But Marissa did not rush to grab fame. She chose carefully, valuing spaces where her voice could uplift others, not just herself. One day, as she sat under a tree on campus, her favorite spot from years ago, she noticed a young woman hesitating at the edge of the green, textbooks in her arms, nerves in her eyes. Marissa smiled and patted the grass beside her. "You like calculus?" she asked. The girl shook her head shyly. "I want to, but I am not good at it." Marissa's smile deepened. "Maybe you just have not had someone explain it the right way yet?" And so they sat, two women from different generations, solving limits and derivatives under the rustling leaves, not for praise, not for proof, but because understanding should never be gatekept. Behind arrogance, because brilliance can come from anyone-anywhere. Back in the lecture hall, Professor Harris, now a changed, man, had a plaque on the door. It read, "This classroom was once silenced by doubt, until a woman who was underestimated reminded us that genius often wears quiet clothes." Marissa never asked for recognition. She had lived her life in quiet service. But now she had something even greater. Her voice returned, her purpose restored, in a world that finally was listening. Because sometimes the greatest minds are not the loudest in the room, but the ones who never stopped solving problems in silence, waiting for a moment to rise.